Hello again. Are you ready to learn some more about the skull? So, I've introduced the bones to you, and what I want to do now is introduce some openings in the skull. These are openings where blood vessels pass through or nerves, and in plural they're called foramina, but singular foramen. So I'll be telling you about a lot of foramens and canals. All right, let's start off on the underside of the skull where there's quite a few openings. And who can miss this one? So this is the foramen magnum, which means big hole. In, I don't know if it's Latin or Greek, but it means big hole. And we'll see that the vertebral column will articulate with that. And all right, so that's a big obvious one. Let's take a closer look here on the underside of the skull. And here's another fairly obvious one. You see this kind of big bumpy part of the occipital, but then on either side there's foramen lacerum. So foramen lacerum, we will see this one on the exterior of the skull as we're seeing it right now. We'll also see it on the interior of the skull. All right, and I'll do that in another video. So foramen lacerum, also nearby here, you see this fairly obvious opening too. You notice it doesn't go straight through the skull. It's called the carotid canal because it kind of tunnels through the bone. And not surprisingly, the carotid artery heads towards the brain through this opening, and it kind of tunnels through the bone here, and then will actually exit through the foramen lacerum. All right, and then nearby, just have to tilt the skull a little bit, you can see the jugular canal, and that's where the jugular vein drains the brain. One thing about the carotid, it's not the only blood vessel that serves the brain. There is one that goes through the foramen magnum. All right. Well, let's take a look here on the side, and here's an obvious opening, like your ear hole, but anatomists give it a more complicated name. What can you expect? So this is called the external auditory meatus, and it is indeed one of those features of the temporal bone. So it's one of the things that makes the temporal bone so cool. Then let's take a look here at the front of the skull, and you'll see, well, this very obvious structure, the orbit. So we know that. Now, taking a look inside the orbit, you can see these two obvious openings. One is nice and rounded, and one's kind of like a gash. And I'm trying to get my thing around here. Okay, so this one kind of nice rounded opening is the optic canal. And then this, where it's kind of a bit of a gash, that's the superior orbital fissure. I'll bring it back a little bit just so it can focus a little bit better. So superior orbital fissure. Then I want to introduce you to three openings that sort of go together in that they're different branches of one cranial nerve, and they come through these openings. So let's take a look. This, you know, now that you're kind of getting used to some anatomy, you might be able to name these openings yourself. I mean, sure, you have the list to take a look at, but if you didn't have that, you could probably maybe guess the names of these openings. This is called the supraorbital foramen. So it is superior to the orbit opening is basically the way you would figure that out in terms of anatomy, superior to the orbit hole. But we call it supraorbital foramen. This one's called infraorbital foramen. This is in the maxilla. This one was in the frontal, is in the frontal. And then we have this one. This is the mental foramen. And this is in the mandible. Pretty neat looking, right? These are all coming off of cranial nerve number 5. It's called the trigeminal nerve. And it ends up being important for dentists. I think dentists learn a lot about the trigeminal nerve. It ends up being something important. You might want to inject Novocaine to numb branches of the trigeminal nerve in different places to different kinds of surgeries. Okay, so there's a lot of those openings. Hello. I know it looks like the skull's talking to you. It's me, Dr. Raylman. And I know you might be wondering, where is she filming this? And does she have skulls in her own home? What's up with that? Yes, I am filming in my own home. And I don't normally have skulls in my house, except for, the skull in my own head. So this is just, one of those things that happens in COVID. You record things in your own home. And so I have these skulls as partial company, just for now. Now, what I wanted to do was show you some of the bones that we've already learned, but we'll look at them on the inside of the skull. So let's take a look at the interior of the skull. Take the little lid off here. Ta-da! And you'll see some of these bones now from the inside. And I'm going to bring it pretty close so you can see these sutures. You see a suture here? All right, and then here. And you can also kind of confirm here from the outside. But this is the frontal. So we had seen the frontal here. We know that it's on the top of the orbit. And then here it is as well. There's a little suture there. And this is an interesting thing to see here. This is taking a look at the top of the nasal cavity. You can see, I guess you can get a bit of a sense here of the proximity of the nasal cavity to your brain. Now, the bone that's here, just there, is ethmoid. And we had seen that, well, I'll show you. We had seen that here. So that's the top of the nasal cavity. Let me show you over here again of this bone. In a lot of the skulls in our collection, the ethmoid ends up breaking. Not here, but in the orbit, since it's a fragile bone. One thing to take a look at when you do get in our lab and look at the bones is the relative robustness of different portions of the skull. There are areas where the bones are thinner and more fragile, and then areas where the bones are thicker. And in the coloring book, they reference these as kind of being like pillars. I guess you can think of it as the structure of a car. Where they have areas where there's lots of relative strength and is designed to be able to withstand impact and the jarring of the skull. Now I'm talking about skulls again and not cars. And so just like that, there are these areas of relative thickness that are able to kind of take the blows in order to protect some of these more fragile bones. That there's this robustness around the orbit and it would take quite a bit of a serious damage in order to also fracture these bones, unless there is an immediate injury only to the orbit. Well, then these other bones wouldn't be able to take that. Okay, but back to this, where we were. So we've got our frontal bone and we've got our ethmoid. Now there's this bone here, the sphenoid, and again I'm going to get you close so that you can see these sutures. It's a bit kind of wing-like when you see it from the inside here. So this is sphenoid, crosses over here, and then when you take a look here, you can see with this suture that you've got temporal bone here, and then a suture here and goes down here. So this is all temporal. Temporal is a bit of a complicated bone for all these bones in the skull. This one has got quite a lot going on the outside and on the inside here. There is this raised portion. There's what they call the squamous and the petrous portion, petrous and squamous portions of the temporal bone, but that makes a bit of an interesting shape too. And then you can also see the suture, and then you can see indeed all of this occipital bone, and indeed the occipital is the bone that the spinal cord comes, arises into. So there's this big foramen magnum within the occipital bone. And again, you can kind of confirm these, like for the sphenoid here, you can kind of flip over here and kind of confirm it with this bone here. I guess it's not as good at looking on this smaller skull, but yeah, sphenoid here, and you've got our temporal. There's the suture right here for temporal coming across here. You can kind of confirm, oh yeah, and then see it over here, and then the occipital, and we had the frontal and the ethmoid. So all of those. Are you ready for some sutures? I'm going to tell you about 4 sutures. They're between the cranial bones, and I think you'll find that the names are pretty easy for you. Well, for the most part. These first 2 definitely. So I'll start off with this suture here. It's called the coronal suture, and it is a big suture between the frontal bone and these parietal bones. And this suture, like the 2 next sutures, you'll notice that it's sort of serrated. It has a serrate suture, you might call it fenestrated, and that allows for this interlocking between the bones. Okay, so coronal, and it's along the coronal plane. Makes sense, right? Okay, then this one makes sense too, sagittal. So this is the sagittal suture. It runs here from the coronal suture to this one that we will learn in a second, lambdoidal suture. And this one separates these 2 parietal bones. Okay, serrated as well. Then this one I just referred to, lambdoidal suture. That's not a word that you say a lot. It gets that name because it has this kind of going up to a point and coming down again, which the anatomists thought of as being similar to the Greek letter lambda. So they're saying it's lambda-ish, basically, in the way they're explaining things. So lambdoidal. Okay. But in the language of anatomy, it makes sense. And then this last suture, it is not serrate. It is here, just here on the top of the temporal bone. This is called the squamous suture. And you will remember the word squamous from when we were learning about histology, and we were learning about cells that were flat, and you might go, well, what the heck, why is this suture being called squamous? It doesn't seem very squamous. But what is in reference to is this part of the temporal bone. This is called the squamous portion of the temporal bone, and squamous needs scale. And so I think what they're saying is that this is kind of like a roundish, kind of flat thing that seems sort of like a scale. I don't know. You can debate about it, but that's what I think they were thinking about. Okay?